Miranda's heart raced as she stepped into the lavish ballroom, the warm glow of chandeliers casting a spotlight on the opulence surrounding her. It was Elsie's engagement party, a night that should have been filled with joy and celebration. But Miranda couldn't shake the uneasiness that had settled in the pit of her stomach. As she mingled with the guests, she noticed the subtle glances and whispers from Calvin's parents, Theo and Clarice. Their eyes seemed to linger on her a little too long, their expressions a mix of disdain and condescension. Miranda made her way to the bar, hoping a glass of wine would calm her nerves. As she waited for her drink, she overheard a conversation between Theo and one of his acquaintances. "Can you believe our Calvin is marrying into that family?" Theo scoffed, his voice laced with contempt. "Miranda is a video editor, for God's sake. No college education, no pedigree. I shudder to think of the influence she'll have on our grandchildren." Miranda's grip tightened around her glass, knuckles turning white. She wanted nothing more than to confront Theo right then and there, but she held her tongue. This was Elsie's night, and she wouldn't let their petty elitism ruin it. As the night wore on, Miranda kept a watchful eye on Theo and Clarice. Their snide remarks seemed endless, each one a carefully veiled insult aimed at her and her family's modest upbringing. "Did you see what she's wearing?" Clarice whispered to her husband, eyeing Miranda's dress with disdain. "Clearly she has no sense of style or class." Miranda clenched her jaw, fighting back the urge to lash out. She knew their words were nothing more than a reflection of their own insecurities and prejudices. But it still stung, like 1,000 tiny needles pricking at her heart. As the party drew to a close, Miranda found herself in a quiet corner, her mind racing with thoughts of revenge. She couldn't let Theo and Clarice continue to belittle her and her family. She had to do something, to protect Elsie from their toxic influence. With a newfound determination, Miranda vowed to herself that she would expose Theo and Clarice for who they truly were. No matter what it took, she would make sure their elitist ways were brought to light. And they would face the consequences of their actions. As Miranda left the party, her steps were heavy with purpose. The battle lines had been drawn, and she was ready to fight for her family's honor, no matter the cost. In the days following Elsie's engagement party, Miranda found herself consumed by a burning desire for justice. The blatant disrespect and elitism displayed by Theo and Clarice had ignited a fire within her, and she was determined to expose their true colors. As a skilled video editor, Miranda knew she possessed a powerful tool, the ability to capture moments and present them in a way that revealed the harsh realities beneath the polished facades. She made a plan, meticulously preparing to document every snide remark and condescending glance from Calvin's parents. At the next pre-wedding gathering, a brunch hosted by Theo and Clarice, Miranda arrived early, concealing a high-quality microphone on her person. As the guests arrived, she observed the couple's behavior with a watchful eye, her finger poised over the record button. "Look at them," Clarice sneered, eyeing a group of guests with disdain. "Barely scraping by, yet they have the audacity to show their faces here." Miranda pressed record, capturing every word. Throughout the brunch, Theo and Clarice continued their onslaught of insults, their words dripping with contempt for anyone they deemed beneath their social standing. "I can't believe Calvin is marrying into that family," Theo spat, his voice laced with venom. "It's a disgrace to our name." Miranda's heart pounded in her chest, but she remained focused, documenting every vile utterance. After the brunch, she retreated to her editing suite, meticulously reviewing the recordings. As she listened to Theo and Clarice's words, her anger grew, fueling her determination to bring their cruelty to light. Over the next few weeks, Miranda attended every pre-wedding event, her camera and microphone ever present. She captured Theo's dismissive sneers and Clarice's condescending glares, building a damning collection of evidence against them. "You should be grateful we're even allowing this union," Clarice hissed at Elsie during a dress fitting. "It's more than you deserve." Miranda's jaw clenched, her fingers digging into the armrests of her chair as she recorded the vile exchange. As the wedding day drew nearer, Miranda's collection of footage grew, each clip a testament to the depth of Theo and Clarice's elitist attitudes. She spent countless hours editing and compiling the recordings, ensuring that every insult, every condescending remark was meticulously preserved. With each passing day, Miranda's resolve hardened. She would not let Theo and Clarice's cruelty go unchecked, no matter the cost. The time for reckoning was fast approaching, and she was ready to unleash the truth upon them, exposing their toxic behavior for all to see. The tension was palpable as I stepped into Theo and Clarice's opulent mansion for a family dinner. The chandeliers glittered above, casting an almost mocking light on the extravagant surroundings. I steeled myself, knowing that this night would be a true test of my fortitude. As we gathered around the table, Elsie beamed with excitement, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling beneath the surface. Theo and Clarice, however, wasted no time in asserting their dominance, their eyes fixated on me with a mixture of disdain and contempt. "Miranda, dear," Clarice began, her voice dripping with condescension, "I must say I'm surprised you accepted our invitation. This setting must be quite unfamiliar to you." I felt the barb pierce my skin, but I refused to flinch. "On the contrary, Clarice," I replied, my tone measured. "I find these surroundings rather comfortable. It's the company that leaves something to be desired." Theo's eyes narrowed, and I could see the anger simmering beneath his polished exterior. "Watch your tongue, girl," he spat. "You may be family by marriage, but you'll never truly belong in our world." Elsie shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension but unsure of its source. "Father, please," she pleaded. "This is supposed to be a celebration." "Celebration?" Theo scoffed. "How can we celebrate when our son has chosen to taint our legacy with such unsavory associations?" The venom in his words was unmistakable, and I felt my own anger rising like a tidal wave. Before I could respond, Clarice chimed in, her voice laced with condescension. "Honestly, Miranda, I shudder to think of the influence you'll have on our grandchildren," she sneered. "A woman of your background can hardly be expected to instill the proper values." That was the final straw. I slammed my fist on the table, causing the silverware to rattle. "Enough!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the cavernous dining room. "I've endured your insults and snide remarks for far too long." Theo and Clarice recoiled, their faces a mask of shock and outrage. Elsie, however, looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. "What are you talking about, Miranda?" she asked, her brow furrowed. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what was to come. "Your precious in-laws have been undermining me from the moment they learned of our connection," I explained, my gaze fixed on Theo and Clarice. "Every snide comment, every condescending glance, I've endured it all for your sake, Elsie. But no more." As the truth spilled forth, Elsie's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. Theo and Clarice, on the other hand, were positively livid, their faces contorted with rage. "How dare you accuse us of such despicable behavior?" Clarice hissed, her voice trembling with fury. But I was prepared. With a few taps on my phone, I played back the recordings I had meticulously gathered, the damning evidence of their elitist attitudes echoing through the room. The reaction was instantaneous. Elsie's eyes widened in horror, while Theo and Clarice sat stunned, their mouths agape. In that moment, the scales had fallen from their eyes, and the truth lay bare before them. As the final recording faded, a deafening silence descended upon the room. I looked at Theo and Clarice, my jaw set in determination. The battle had been fought, and I had emerged victorious. The reckoning had begun. The aftermath of the disastrous family dinner left me reeling, but my resolve had never been stronger. Theo and Clarice's vile behavior had pushed me to the brink, and I knew that decisive action was necessary. As I pored over the recordings and footage I had gathered, a plan began to take shape in my mind. This time, I wouldn't merely expose their cruelty to a select few. I would lay bare their true colors for the world to see. The wedding day was rapidly approaching, and I knew that would be my chance to strike. With my skills as a video editor, I could create a damning compilation of Theo and Clarice's most despicable moments, a veritable highlight reel of their elitism and disdain. But capturing the footage was only half the battle. I needed to ensure that it would be seen by as many people as possible, and that meant taking control of the audiovisual setup at the wedding venue. Through a series of discreet inquiries, I learned that the venue relied on a team of freelance technicians to handle their AV needs. It was a stroke of luck, as I had worked with several of them before on various projects. One by one, I reached out to the technicians, carefully weaving a web of favors and obligations. Some owed me for past collaborations, while others were swayed by the promise of future work. Slowly but surely, I secured their allegiance, ensuring that I would have unfettered access to the venue's AV systems on the big day. With the technical aspect taken care of, I turned my attention to the footage itself. Hour after hour, I pored over the recordings, meticulously editing and compiling the most damning clips. Theo's sneering dismissals, Clarice's condescending insults, every vile utterance was carefully preserved and arranged for maximum impact. As the wedding day drew nearer, my nerves were a tangled knot of anticipation and apprehension. But I knew that there could be no turning back. Theo and Clarice had pushed me too far, and they would face the consequences of their actions. In the days leading up to the wedding, I made my final preparations. Hidden cameras and microphones were strategically placed throughout the venue, ensuring that every angle would be covered. I left no stone unturned, determined to capture every last drop of their elitist venom. The night before the big day, I found myself sitting in my editing suite, staring at the completed compilation. The footage was damning, a searing indictment of Theo and Clarice's toxic behavior. A part of me felt a twinge of guilt, knowing that the fallout would be far-reaching and potentially devastating. But then I thought of Elsie, of the hurt and betrayal she would feel when she learned the truth. I thought of the countless others who had suffered under the weight of Theo and Clarice's disdain, their spirits crushed by the relentless onslaught of insults and condescension. With a steely resolve, I made my final preparations. The time for justice had come, and I was ready to unleash the storm that had been brewing for far too long. Theo and Clarice had sown the seeds of their own downfall, and now they would reap the bitter harvest. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within me. As I made my way to the venue, every step felt heavier, weighted by the gravity of what was to come. Upon arrival, I immediately sought out the AV team, the carefully cultivated allies who would play a crucial role in my plan. One by one, they confirmed their readiness, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. "You sure about this, Miranda?" One of the technicians asked, his brow furrowed with concern. I nodded, my jaw set with determination. More sure than I've ever been about anything in my life. As the guests began to arrive, I took up my position in the control room, a nerve center from which I could orchestrate the entire operation. Through the monitors, I watched as Theo and Clarice made their grand entrance, their heads held high, oblivious to the reckoning that awaited them. The ceremony itself was a blur, a carefully choreographed dance of pomp and circumstance. But beneath the surface, the tension was palpable, a taut cord threatening to snap at any moment. Throughout the proceedings, Theo and Clarice couldn't resist their usual antics. Subtle glances of disdain, hushed whispers dripping with contempt, they seemed utterly incapable of curbing their elitist tendencies, even on their son's wedding day. "Just look at them," Clarice muttered, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the assembled guests. "A veritable parade of commoners." Theo chuckled, a mirthless sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Well, what did you expect, dear? Our son has chosen to associate with the dregs of society." Their words cut like daggers, but I remained steadfast, my focus unwavering. Every insult, every condescending remark was meticulously captured by the hidden cameras and microphones, adding fuel to the fire that burned within me. As the ceremony drew to a close, I felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on me like a physical force. The moment of reckoning was fast approaching, and my heart pounded in my chest, a thunderous rhythm echoing the fury that coursed through my veins. When the time came for the reception, I made my move. With a few deft keystrokes, I seized control of the venue's audiovisual systems, ensuring that every screen, every speaker was under my command. The guests milled about, oblivious to the storm that was about to be unleashed. Theo and Clarice, ever the picture of arrogance, held court in the center of the room, their laughter ringing out like a mocking taunt. But their smug expressions soon gave way to confusion as the screens flickered to life, the speakers crackling with the unmistakable sound of their own voices. "A veritable parade of commoners," Clarice's voice echoed through the room, her disdain laid bare for all to hear. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps of shock and outrage rippled through the crowd as the damning footage played out, each clip more damning than the last. Theo and Clarice stood frozen, their faces drained of color, as the full weight of their cruelty was exposed to the world. In that moment, the tables had turned, and they were the ones forced to confront the ugly truth of their own elitism. As the final clip faded to black, a deafening silence descended upon the room. All eyes were fixed on Theo and Clarice, their once lofty personas reduced to rubble by the weight of their own words. And in that moment, I knew that justice had been served. The silence that descended upon the reception hall was deafening, a palpable weight that seemed to press down on us all. As the last echoes of Theo and Clarice's damning words faded, the room erupted into a maelstrom of chaos. Gasps of shock and outrage rippled through the crowd like a tidal wave, crashing against the stunned expressions of the disgraced couple. Theo's face had drained of all color, his eyes wide and unblinking, as if he couldn't quite comprehend the reality that had been laid bare before him. Clarice, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of fury, her features contorted into a mask of rage and disbelief. "How dare you?" she screeched, her voice shrill and piercing. "How dare you expose us like this?" Her accusatory gaze fell upon me, and for a moment I felt a flicker of doubt. But then I remembered the countless insults, the endless stream of condescension that had been leveled at me and my family. The doubt withered, replaced by a steely resolve that burned brighter than ever before. "I dare," I replied, my voice carrying across the hushed room, "because someone had to stop you. Your cruelty, your elitism, it had to be exposed for the world to see." Clarice opened her mouth to respond, but was cut off by a voice that silenced us all. "Mother, father." Calvin's tone was heavy with disappointment, a weight that seemed to crush him beneath its burden. "Is it true? Did you really say those things?" Theo and Clarice exchanged a fleeting glance, a silent communication passing between them. But there was no denying the evidence, no way to spin or obfuscate the raw truth that had been laid bare. "Calvin, my boy," Theo began, his voice trembling with a mixture of desperation and anger. "You have to understand, we were just—" "Just what, father?" Calvin interrupted, his eyes hardening. "Just being yourselves. Just expressing the disdain and contempt you've always harbored for anyone you deem beneath you?" The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating in their weight. Theo and Clarice looked around the room, their gazes meeting a sea of accusatory stares and disgusted expressions. It was Clarice who spoke next, her voice laced with a venomous blend of anger and desperation. "You've ruined everything," she spat, her eyes boring into me with a hatred that sent a chill down my spine. "This was supposed to be our day, our moment to celebrate our family's legacy." "Your legacy?" I couldn't help but scoff, the bitter taste of vindication coating my words. "Your legacy is one of cruelty and discrimination, of looking down on anyone who doesn't meet your twisted standards of elitism." Clarice recoiled as if struck, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Theo, meanwhile, seemed to crumple in on himself, the weight of his exposed sins bearing down upon his shoulders. It was in that moment that Calvin stepped forward, his expression one of resolute determination. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tumult like a knife. "I've heard all I need to hear." He turned to face Theo and Clarice, his eyes brimming with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "I love you both, but I can't condone this behavior any longer. The person I thought I knew, the parents I respected and admired, they don't exist. Not anymore." Theo and Clarice looked stricken, their faces etched with the realization that their carefully constructed facade had crumbled to dust. In that moment, they were exposed, laid bare for all to see, not as the pillars of society they had so desperately clung to, but as twisted, spiteful shells of human beings. As Calvin turned to face me, his expression softened, a glimmer of understanding passing between us. "Miranda, Elsie," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry you had to endure this, but I promise you things will be different from now on." In that moment, I knew that the battle had been won. The toxic influence of Theo and Clarice had been laid bare, their carefully cultivated veneer of superiority shattered beyond repair. And while the road ahead was sure to be difficult, I took solace in the knowledge that justice had prevailed, a reckoning long overdue, but all the sweeter for its arrival. The aftermath of my exposure was like a shockwave rippling through the reception hall. Guests stood frozen in stunned silence, their eyes darting between me and the disgraced couple that had once held such sway over them. Theo and Clarice, their faces twisted into masks of rage and humiliation, seemed to shrink under the weight of the collective scrutiny. Clarice's mouth opened and closed like a gasping fish, her normally imperious demeanor shattered by the irrefutable evidence of her own cruelty. "You," she sputtered, her voice thick with venom as she fixed her gaze upon me. "You've ruined everything." Theo, for his part, seemed to have retreated into himself. His eyes glazed over as if he couldn't quite comprehend the reality that had been laid bare before him. It was Calvin who broke the tense silence, his voice ringing out clear and resolute. "Mother, Father, I can't," he faltered, shaking his head in a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. "I never knew you harbored such hatred, such disdain for others." Clarissa's eyes widened, a flicker of something akin to fear passing across her features. "Calvin, darling, you must understand," she began, her tone laced with desperation, but Calvin raised a hand, cutting her off with a single sharp gesture. "No, Mother," he said, his jaw set with determination. "I don't have to understand anything. What you've done, the way you've treated Miranda and her family, it's inexcusable." Theo seemed to snap out of his daze at that, his eyes narrowing as he turned his withering gaze upon me. "This is all you're doing, you wretched girl." He spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You've poisoned our son against us, turned him against his own family." A murmur of outrage rippled through the crowd, but Calvin silenced them with a single raised hand. "Don't you dare blame Miranda for this," he said, his tone firm and unyielding. "She's done nothing more than expose the truth, a truth you've been all too happy to conceal behind your masks of privilege and superiority." Theo recoiled as if struck, his mouth opening and closing in a futile attempt to formulate a response. Clarice, however, rallied her defiance, her eyes flashing with fury. "How dare you speak to us this way?" she hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "We are your parents, your family. You owe us your loyalty, your respect." Calvin let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Respect?" he echoed, his voice tinged with a mixture of sadness and disgust. "How can I respect people who harbor such hatred, such contempt for those they deem beneath them?" He turned to face me and Elsie, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Miranda, Elsie, I'm so sorry you had to endure this. Please know that I had no idea the depths of their cruelty, their elitism." Elsie stepped forward, her eyes brimming with a mixture of hurt and determination. "It's not your fault, Calvin," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil swirling within her. "But you have to choose, them or us." Calvin's gaze hardened as he turned back to face his parents, his shoulders squared and his jaw set with resolve. "She's right," he said, his voice ringing out like a proclamation. "And I choose them, the people who have shown me true loyalty, true love, the people who have opened my eyes to the ugliness that festers within you." Theo and Clarice seemed to deflate before our eyes, their once imperious stances crumpling under the weight of their son's rejection. Clarice opened her mouth, perhaps to plead or protest, but the words never came. Instead, a heavy silence descended upon the room, punctuated only by the occasional murmur or gasp from the assembled guests. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a damning indictment of the twisted values that had once held sway over this gathering. As I looked around at the faces in the crowd, I saw a mixture of emotions, shock, disgust, and in some cases a flicker of understanding. It was as if a veil had been lifted, exposing the true depths of Theo and Clarice's elitism for all to see. In that moment, I knew that a shift had occurred, a seismic upheaval that had shaken the very foundations of the social order they had zealously guarded. The scales had fallen from their eyes, and they were left exposed, their true natures laid bare for the world to witness. It was a reckoning long overdue, a karmic retribution that had been years in the making, and as I looked upon the broken, defeated figures of Theo and Clarice, I felt a sense of satisfaction. Not one born of petty vengeance, but of justice finally being served. In the days and weeks that followed the cataclysmic events of the wedding, a palpable shift occurred within our family dynamic. The toxic influence of Theo and Clarice, which had once loomed so large and inescapable, had been severed, a malignant growth excised from our lives. Elsie and Calvin, buoyed by the newfound freedom and clarity that came with their decision, seemed to flourish in the absence of Theo and Clarice's oppressive presence. Gone were the furtive glances and forced smiles, replaced by a genuine warmth and openness that had been stifled for far too long. "I feel like I can breathe again," Elsie confided in me one afternoon, her eyes shining with a newfound lightness. "It's like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders." Calvin, too, seemed to have undergone a transformation, his once guarded demeanor giving way to a more open, authentic self. "I can't believe I let them control me for so long," he admitted, shaking his head with a rueful smile. "It's like I've been living in a fog, and you helped clear the air." As for Theo and Clarice, their fate was sealed the moment their true colors were exposed. The fallout from that fateful day was swift and uncompromising. They found themselves ostracized from the very social circles they had once lorded over, their names tarnished by the stain of their own prejudice and elitism. I caught glimpses of them in the weeks that followed, their once imperious stances replaced by a hunched, defeated bearing. Clarice, in particular, seemed to wilt under the weight of her disgrace, her perfectly coiffed veneer crumbling to reveal the embittered shell beneath. Yet, as I observed their downfall from afar, I found myself feeling not triumph or vindication, but a strange sense of pity. These were broken people, their lives defined by hatred and contempt, a truly tragic existence, devoid of the warmth and connection that truly mattered. In the end, their legacy would be one of cautionary tale, a reminder of the corrosive nature of prejudice and the importance of embracing our shared humanity, regardless of station or circumstance. As for Elsie and Calvin, their path forward was one of hope and renewal. With the toxic influences of the past firmly behind them, they embarked on a new chapter, one built on a foundation of love, understanding, and acceptance. "We're starting over, building something real and true," Elsie told me, her eyes shining with determination. "No more masks, no more pretense. Just us, authentic and unapologetic." And as I watched them forge ahead, hand in hand, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and contentment. The battle had been hard fought, the wounds deep and enduring, but in the end, justice had prevailed not through vengeance or retribution, but through the simple act of exposing the truth. As for me, the journey had been one of personal growth and self-discovery. I had faced my own demons, my own insecurities, and emerged victorious. Not by stooping to the level of those who sought to belittle me, but by rising above and embracing the fundamental truth that we are all equal, deserving of respect and dignity. In the months and years that followed, I found myself reflecting on the lessons learned, the hard-won wisdom that had been forged in the crucible of our family's struggles. And as I looked to the future, I did so with a renewed sense of purpose and clarity. My path illuminated by the knowledge that true strength lies not in the trappings of wealth or status, but in the courage to stand up for what is right, to be a beacon of hope and understanding in a world that so often succumbs to fear and division. For in the end, it was not revenge or retribution that had set us free, but the simple act of letting the truth shine through. A powerful reminder that light, no matter how faint, has the power to banish even the darkest of shadows.